To get started, this is Session 7, Sustainable Development and Protection of the Environment. And we'll start off with just an introduction of the related video and poster presentations. I myself am Adrienne Etche. I work for the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, as well as on loan with the International Commission on Radiation Protection as a technical secretary. For this session, there were 22 submissions total. There's 16 posters that you can find online and on site, so if you go to the poster room, you'll be able to find them there. But there's 2 posters that are online only, and I've noted this as we go through the posters, as well as 4 pre-recorded videos, and again, I've noted that where they are videos, but there are 2 screens in the poster room if you wish to view them there, but again, you can see them online. And as you can see, over 55% of the submissions were from Japan. It's not surprising, but we have another array of other countries represented with Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan, Slovenia, and South Korea. Going through the posters, I was able to categorize them largely into 4 themes, with a focus either on methodology, seasonal and spatial variation, natural background or baseline, and contaminant transport. And all the poster submissions I found very valuable, so I've just quickly tried to find highlight points for each rather than focusing on a few. For the methodology section, there's integrated dose assessment as a tool for sustainable environmental radiation protection. And one of the interesting points of that poster was that non-human are adequately protected when coexisting with humans. There's a study on influence of factors on radon exhalation rate from soil, the improvement of accumulation chamber technique, and they found a decreased potential effects on radon exhalation rate measurements from the soil that improved the accuracy of the results. Now note, these 2 are online only. The estimation of the minimum detectable activity for underwater radiation monitoring systems, and this is actually a new methodology that's being developed for radioactive contamination monitoring in drinking water, specifically for cesium-137 and iodine-131. And there's also a systematic review of environmental effects after the Fukushima accident, comparison with ICRP DCRL, and noted that there's the most estimated dose rates were on or below the DCRL band, but several did exceed, mainly immediately after the incident. There's 2 videos. Again, you can only see these online or on the video screens in the poster room. To leave or not to leave, a tiered assessment of the impacts of scale residue from decommissioned offshore oil and gas infrastructure in Australia. And as the last session you may have noticed, Amy McIntosh was presenting other aspect of the same project. But here it's a tiered assessment to enable the optimization for decommissioning to find the optimal solution. There's also the development of population-level biomarkers for low-dose radiation and the importance of non-targeted effects. And for theirs, I found a discrepancy between measured field data and acute lab-based experimental data, and the importance of being able to extrapolate between the 2. For seasonal and spatial variation, the first poster that I found fit within this category well was the deposition distribution of lead-210 in the northern hemisphere, derived from calculations using long-range atmospheric transport deposition model. And they did note seasonal variation with increased deposition on the Pacific side of Japan during winter compared to the eastern part. And deposition patterns also varied across latitudinal zones, with the lowest in polar subpolar regions. Another one, the attributes of beryllium-7 and lead-210 dynamics in the lower atmosphere of Osaka, Japan, alongside the size dispersion of key chemical constituents within aerosols adhered to beryllium-7. And they did note seasonal trends with these 2 radionuclides, with deposition displaying a similar pattern with higher deposition rates in March to July and October, and lower rates in the winter period. There's also assessment of tritium concentrations in precipitation and tap water collected in Thailand, and they again noted seasonal variation with higher tritium concentrations during the summer and lower concentrations in the rainy season. And tritium concentrations varied with latitude again, where sampling sites in the northern region had higher levels than those located in the southern regions. For natural background or baseline, there's a rapid assessment of mutational risks in tree species exposed to low-dose rate radiation following the nuclear disaster in 2011, and they found no correlations between observed mutations and the ambient dose rates or cesium-137 concentration. There's assessment of radiological hazard parameters in coastal sands as well as river sediments in Kanyakumari, a high background natural radiation area in India. And they found for mean radium-226, thorium-232, and potassium-40 activity concentrations in the river sediments had an influence on the coastal sands. And for indoor radon and thoron concentration in Bangladesh dwellings, the capital Dhaka and northern high radiation background area, they found that radon and I think the tin in Bangladesh dwellings are unique and varied with building materials and ventilation rate. The powder sandwich technique to assess radon-thoron exhalation and emanation in the North Abu Roshid mylonitic rock samples in Egypt found that radon and thoron measurements were important for estimating dose to population. And for another poster, research into the aerial uptake of H2O vapors by pepper and eggplant, the tritium activity in plants, and external environmental factors showed a moderate to considerable relationship. And note that these two are videos. Comprehensive environmental radioactivity study of mineral sands operation, noting the importance and variability in natural background areas of mineral sands mineralization. And another video on the global seafood dose in 2023 with assessment by an international team. And the results indicated higher seafood dose rates for typical consumers than was previously noted in other studies. For contaminate transport, the last of the themes, the radiological status of big-hoofed animals inhabiting the semi-Palatinsik test site, that they found no permissible values of 137 cesium and strontium-90 in animals exposed to high radionuclide content and diet are expected to be exceeded. For poster 2075, there's artificial radionuclides, accumulation by potatoes under different radioactive soil contamination, and they found soil radioactive contamination varies with type of nuclear explosion. And there's two posters, 2080 and 2090, that are presenting aspects of the same study. Distribution of radioactive cesium-rich microparticles in soil on the forest slopes in Fukushima. And they found evidence of cesium microparticle downward migration in soil, as well as remobilization from upper slopes in forested areas. There's another poster on the research into the impact by the radiation factor on structural and anatomical indicators of plants under conditions of simulated experiment, and they found evidence of lamina's unique role in conserving contaminants in plants. And another poster looked at radionuclide desorption from post-wildfire ash and its effect on river water activity concentrations in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And they found a frequency of high strontium-90 concentrations increased in river water following the wildfires. And thank you. If you would like to access the poster, there's a QR code as well as the link, or go in the room for the ones that are here.
Great. Thank you so much, Adrian, for that very clear and thorough summary of the posters and videos. Just a quick check for people sitting in the back. Could you hear okay? Someone wave at me if you could hear okay? Great. Awesome. Excellent. So we have an exciting session, I think, for you today on sustainable development and protection of the environment. We have a couple of team-based presentations, which is fun. And then at the end, we'll have a panel discussion. You can see myself, my distinguished co-chair here, Keiko, and the variety of folks here at these tables will be available for a panel discussion. So let's get started then with our first presentation is going to be by, I'm sorry for my American accent, Christelle Adam-Guermin from IRIS in France and Andy Mayo from the Environmental Agency in the UK.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Keiko. And I'm happy to be here today to present the ongoing work on Task Group 99 and 105. So I'm going to present that with my colleague Andy Mayal from the Environment Agency from UK, and I am from IRSN. And we are going to present that on behalf of our co-chairs, Jacqueline Garnier-Laplace and David Copperstone, and on behalf also of the other members of our task groups. So, first introduction on the environmental radio protection from the point of view of ICRP. So, the ICRP publication 108, and it's a series of companion publications, and also in the general recommendation, the main protection targets for the environmental protection was defined. And they were defined as the maintenance of biological diversity, conservation of species, protection of health and status of natural habitats, of communities and ecosystems. So those targets generally relate to population or even higher biological organization levels, and not to individuals, because the aim is to protect the dynamics of populations and not individuals, except in the case of rare and endangered species. So a demonstration is proposed for the protection of the environment through two important concepts, the RAP concept, so reference animal and plants. So these RAPs were defined in the former publication, and in particular in the publication 108, as organisms representative of different ecosystems, freshwater, marine, and terrestrial ecosystems. And this RAP enable simplified dose assessment for the impact assessment. And this RAP are used to assess the exposure to ionizing radiation, and they can be compared to DCRLs, which are derived consideration reference levels, which are a band of those rates where deleterious effects may occur. So this approach of comparing dose assessment and DCRL is a classical approach for ecological risk assessment. And DCRL, in fact, are benchmark ranges that help to assess radiological risk to non-human species and optimize the protection in accordance with the level of risk in a proportionate manner with the level of risk that is expected. So this ecological risk assessment method evaluates the likelihood and the severity of adverse effects on what is desirable to protect. So in the TG 99, we aim at evolving these two concepts of RAPs and DCRL, and it's something I will present to you now. And in TG 105, the guidance for their application and the integration into the protection on the environment will be presented by Andy after me. And the aim is to experience this new RAP and DCRL from case studies, which aims finally to enhance the applicability and practicability of RAPs. Reference organisms, which are specific organisms that can be chosen when you want to do a specific impact assessment, and the DCRL. So in addition to our two task groups, there are two other task groups related to the protection of the environment. Task group 114, which deals with tolerability and reasonableness, in particular for the environmental protection, but not only. And also the task group 125 related to ecosystem services, where the idea is to integrate ecosystem services into radiological impact assessment. So the overview of the goals and the potential expected changes in the new set of recommendations for the task groups addressing environmental radiological protection can be found in a recent paper from Garnier-Laplace. So why is it needed to broaden the RAP concept? As you can see on this slide, the 12 RAPs that were formally chosen in the precedent, in the prior publication. So these 12 RAPs were representative of different media, and they were chosen at the level of the family. And it was decided to broaden this approach by choosing the RAP at the level of the class in order to be able to integrate other organisms that would not be represented at the level of the family. For example, you can see that there was a deer and a rat. So by enlarging at the mammals class level, you can integrate other data that would not be here. So it enhances the statistical power to perform dose or effect assessment. And in addition, it is enabling also to have a better representativeness with regard to the real biodiversity. So we have chosen different RAPs that you can see here in gray. And we have also added RAPs at the level of vertebrates, invertebrates, and plants, since these levels are commonly used for chemical risk assessments. Regarding the derived consideration reference levels, so you can see on this graph the former DCRL that was used before. So they span over one order of magnitude and have different values for the different RAPs. In the publication 124, it was already written that this notion of DCRL needs to be revised in order to integrate more data. So this idea of having an evolution of DCRL was already there at that time. So how did we update this DCRL? So first, just to have an idea of how it was done in the publication 108, for each RAP at the level of the family, the DCRL were chosen as a band of dose rates covering one order of magnitude that were estimated by expert judgment on the basis of a critical literature review. It must be underlined that for some DCRL, for example duck, there was no underlying publication for the chronic exposure situation. Whereas for the work that is ongoing in TG99, for each RAP at the level of class, we have estimated DCRL as a band of those rates that are derived on the basis of an endpoint sensitivity distribution for the class that is studied. So this sensitivity distribution is a classical approach that is used for ecological risk assessment, and it enables to give a range of variation of sensitivity of ecologically relevant endpoints for all species within a class. Uncertainties were also accounted for, and it's something I will present you more in detail now. So the first step in our DCRL derivation was based on the Frederica database. So this database is a database that is gathering data on dose and effects in non-human species, and it was created under prior European project, Facet and Erica. These dose rate effect relationships were sorted and quality checked in the database, and it was possible to extract on this dose effect relationship EDR10, which is the effect dose rate, which gives a 10% of effect. So a quite low effect that is applicable to chronic low dose rate exposure. So all these EDR10 were gathered on a cumulative weighted probability curve, which is the endpoint sensitivity distribution per class. And these data were also enriched by using acute data that were transformed using an extrapolation factor, which enabled to have a higher statistical power. Here you see an example to derive a DCRL for mammals and fish. So it was proposed to select the 5th percentile of each ESD distribution. And this was the upper part of the DCRL. which was divided by an extrapolation factor that enabled to take into account the different uncertainties. So I'm not going into detail in this extrapolation factor, but you can see that it combines different criteria, for example, the total number of data or the number of species. So this is the results that we got. So you can see on this graph a comparison of DCRL ESD, which are the new DCRL, and DCRL EG for expert judgment, which are the former DCRL. This can be also compared with the background levels for terrestrial and aquatic species. So what can be seen is that the DCRL sometimes cross. Sometimes the DCRL ESD are more conservative than the DCRL EG. But anyway, it's a completely different way of obtaining this DCRL. So in our case, it was based on the evidence-based method, and on the other one, on expert judgment. So it's a different approach. So we compared this DCRL very, very quickly by taking some articles that were published on Fukushima. So it's based on the method that was published by Takada and Schneider. So you can see on this graph that you have a range of those rates. Here, you can see in red the range of those rates observed for Fukushima data, and in green the range of those rates and associated effects for laboratory control conditions. So what you can see, I'm not going to go into detail, but for the dashed bars, which indicate that there is no significant effect observed, this no significant effect data are almost all the time below the DCRL, which is in accordance with the protective level of DCRL. But in some cases, you can also observe the effect below this DCRL, which seems to indicate that in that case, the DCRL are not so protective. So it might be surprising, but if we refer to the publication, we see that these effects, in fact, are very subtle effects, such as DNA single-strand breaks, DNA methylation, modified protein levels. So it's not directly related to the level of the population. To the contrary, there is one paper where the abundance of birds was seen to be affected, so in Fukushima, and it's below the DCRL ESD. However, you can see here a little asterisk here, which indicates that these data were obtained with ambient dose rates, which means that the dose rate might have been underestimated. And we should see a dose rate that would be in the DCRL range. And finally, to compare to the laboratory control condition, you can see that all the data that we got are related to the population dynamics, embryo production, mortality. And this data, where effects are observed, are above the DCRL. So it means that the DCRL are conservative in those cases. And the case where the data is the lowest is the colony queen bumblebee production, which falls into the DCRL, which is still conservative. So the work is still in progress. We are trying also to incorporate Chernobyl data. And I'm going to leave the floor to Andy for specific case studies.
Yeah, thanks, Christelle. So I'm going to pick up the story from where Christelle left off in terms of what TG105 is doing with these data. But before I do that, I just want to say, first of all, good morning to everyone, and it's good to see so many people here and the level of interest this is generating in this kind of big picture and still evolving area of radiological protection. So that's great to see you all here. Just to recap on who I am, I'm Andy Mail from Committee 4. I work for the Environment Agency in England, which is the main environmental regulator in England, including of the nuclear industry and other users of radioactive substances. So what I want to do over the next few minutes is really sort of piece together some of that jigsaw which Christelle showed earlier, that bubble diagram with the four task groups on it, which are all contributing to this area of evolving RP. And it's important to note that they're not the only four. Actually, there are some other groups which obviously feed into this topic area. Task Group 105 is looking at the broader aspects of environmental protection and how these data being generated by Task Group 99 will actually be used in practice, and that includes testing to see, using case studies, actually testing to see whether the data being produced by Task Group 99 will affect any kind of pre-existing case study decisions. So that's one of the things we've been doing. And very importantly, we'll also be kind of evaluating whether these proposed new figures should be adopted in anger, if you like, providing, of course, that they add value and improve the level of protection. Okay, so that's Task Group 105. I'll also cover very briefly Task Group 125, which is about ecosystem services. And just a quick acknowledgement to all the members of those two groups who work very hard in these areas. We've got some of them in the room today. So if I get any difficult questions, I shall be looking around the room to those people. Yeah, so this is onto the TG105's work then. We've recently taken the proposed new values from TG99. So if you look at this table on the right-hand side there, you can see the two columns. They represent the data which is actually currently in ICRP publications, i.e. 108. So they're the current DCRLs which are out there. As Christelle said, they're based on expert judgment, and they're based on taxonomic class of family, taxonomic grouping of family. On the left-hand side are the kind of summarises the newly proposed data, which is kind of still under evaluation, as I've said. And also in this case, we're actually looking at the taxonomic grouping at the class level, which is for those biologists, non-biologists amongst you, you know, it's a higher taxonomic grouping, as Christelle mentioned. So just to point out some of the highlights from those figures, you'll see that if you look at the lower bounds of all of those ranges, you'll see that for all of the rows except for the bottom two rows, the values are becoming less restrictive. So they're going up, in other words. Apart from the bottom two rows, so for crustaceans and worms there, we can see that there is a lowering of those values at the lower range, so potentially more restrictive in those cases. So that's the kind of summary of where we're at with the test, the kind of comparison, if you like, of the new with the old data. The other thing we've been doing is looking at case studies. The case studies range from planned exposure situations where we've evaluated environmental exposures and non-human species doses in the past, through to various existing exposure situations as well. And this graphic kind of summarises some of the results from our case studies, in particular a case study from the Montebello Islands. So it's an existing exposure situation. Some of you know that Montebello Islands are a small group of islands off the north-west coast of Australia, where there was British weapons testing in the 1950s. So it's quite a unique environment. I understand that most of it is a nature reserve, and there's a number of protected species on those islands, various marsupials and various other reptiles and mammal species. So some of the kind of general findings from this case study, really looking at how we might apply the new DCRLs in this situation, and we've discovered a few things. We've come to a number of kind of findings, if you like, but in these situations where specific species are protected, that's going to be a more significant situation than, for example, planned exposure situations where you've got a range of species and you're using more generic assumptions in your calculations. And just a final point on the bottom of the slide there, there's also an issue which we've identified where if you've got an environment where you have protected species and there's some proposals for protecting the genetic pool of that particular species, then there is a question mark over whether any impacts on that genetic gene pool will be significant for future species propagation. So looking at the application of the new RAPs and DCRLs here, looking at two examples, one sea turtle on the left and mammals on the right. For sea turtle, this is quite a good illustration of one of the issues that I'll come to in a minute with any of these kind of wildlife assessments is which, if you've got a species of interest, which reference animal and plant you choose to make your assessment judgment. So that kind of mapping, if you like, to the criteria is an issue currently and will be in the future as well. This is illustrated quite well with the sea turtle example, where currently assessors use the reptile data and in the ERICA tools, which some of you may be aware of. So under the existing RAPs, the nearest analogy that we can choose is frog, which obviously is not a reptile, it's an amphibian, but it's the closest we can get. And the DCRL there is 40 to 400. Under the new data, under the new proposed data, we now have the vertebrate grouping to refer to, and that's slightly less or more restrictive, sorry, so the value's coming down slightly there. For mammals on the right-hand side, in the Montebello Islands, I understand there's five endangered species on those islands. The newly proposed data for mammals shows a less restrictive criteria on the right-hand side there. So the newly proposed criteria 30 to 60. The exposure rate that's been assessed and monitored is 12 micrograms per hour. So currently that falls within that range of the current DCRL. So that for an existing exposure situation suggests that perhaps there's some more that could be done in optimizing that dose, perhaps. But under the new data, that's not going to be so much of an issue. So just a summary of the testing of those outputs then in terms of the exposure situations. For planned exposure situations, there's essentially no changes for the majority of DCRLs. But in some cases, in some case studies for existing exposure situations, the proposed change to some of the lower bounds indicate that protective actions may not be needed based on wildlife assessments. And then coming back to my earlier point about the issue over choosing which reference animal and plant to use in any assessment, that's still an issue, particularly for reptiles, although now we have the option to go up to a higher level of taxonomic grouping at the vertebrate level, which is the phylum level. So these are some of the kind of consequences, if you like, of moving to those newly proposed DCRLs. Then on to kind of the more broader aspects of TG105's work. As was mentioned earlier, one of the main goals of TG105 is to build on the work that was carried out and published in publication 124, to further consider how radiological protection of the environment can be further embedded into the system of radiological protection. So that's our primary goal, really. And some of the kind of conclusions and findings we're coming to at the moment, which are not unsurprising in some cases, is that when we're considering the environment in existing or planned or existing exposure situations in particular, we also need to take into account not just the impact of radiation, but also the impact of any remediation or protective actions that might be proposed as well. And benefits. So, it's a complex equation. So, if we can come into any decision, you need to take those benefits and detriments into account. Several of the case studies identified that environmental protection requirements are driven by the presence of co-contaminants. So, as we heard earlier today, quite often it's the non-radiological contaminants that may pose more of a risk than radiological, or indeed conservation needs. If there's a specific conservation requirement in a particular environment, then that will potentially drive decisions and actions. Many case studies demonstrate the need for an integrated approach. I think that's well accepted now. And then considering conservation drivers, the potential radiological impacts could have more significance for small populations of threatened species, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, this is something which has been proposed previously, but we consider there is potential value in considering a fourth category of exposure, in addition to occupational, medical, and public. There seems to be good reason to include an environment category as well. So that's something to consider. Okay, note on ecosystem services, very briefly. So this is taking the issue much wider than radiological impact on non-human species. This, some of you will be aware that ecosystem services are those benefits and services that ecosystems provide to humans, whether that be economic or cultural, recreational, and so on, that all contribute towards human well-being. And so it's very much an anthropocentric approach, but it can be broadened out to include those kind of more kind of ecocentric values if necessary. So that's all kind of linked to quality of life and well-being. So that's ecosystem services. That group's in its relative infancy, and it's chaired by Nicole, and we're very interested to see their output. UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll just quickly go through this one. So this is where it all comes together, really. So we've been talking this morning pretty much entirely about that environmental pillar of sustainable development. It's one of the three pillars, as some of you may know. You've got environmental, social, and economic. And we need to try to integrate those pillars to make sure we hit that sweet spot of sustainability. But environmental sustainability is obviously a big part of that, and we're hoping that through the work of TG 105 and 125 and 99 and other groups, we can bring all that together to make sure that the system of radiological protection does contribute to sustainable development. So a quick summary then. These are the kind of pieces of the jigsaw, as Christelle outlined earlier. We've talked about how TG99 is looking at the science and looking at the more recent data to make sure that the derived consideration reference levels are fit for purpose and as good as they can be. TG 105 on the right-hand side there, we're taking those data and considering how whether there's added value in adopting those figures, and also the wider aspects of environmental protection. Ecosystem services will feed into this issue as well. That's kind of going beyond dose and radiological impact into other kinds of impact. And then bottom left, tolerability and reasonableness. How do those concepts relate to environmental protection in our system as well? And by bringing all those together, we're hoping that we can demonstrate a positive contribution to sustainable development. And I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank Thank you so much. That was really nice to see. I think the academic through practical considerations and the approach to the ICRP is taking to the environment. Just as a reminder, we are going to have a discussion session after this, so please, if you have a question, write it down so you remember it for later. And I'll invite our next speakers to come up, please. We have Peter Bryant from Sizewell C, the World Nuclear Association. He's out of the UK. And Jim Hundress, also from the World Nuclear Association, out of Australia.
Yes, I'm off that. Because I need this. You can go first.
Okay, turn on, that's always a good start. So as Nicole kindly introduced, we're both kind of working in the nuclear sector, but in very different sides. So I'm very much focused on new nuclear build and previously operation of nuclear power stations and decommissioning. And Jim?
I'm a miner by trade, so 40 years in mineral processing and mining. A consultant at the moment. I don't work for World Nuclear Association. I work for MEN, have many hats on, and also chair of IRP's task group on Norman industry. I should have used the microphone then, shouldn't I?
Yeah. Always helps. So we've got a bit of a double act today, so we have no idea how this is going to go, especially if you've seen either of us talk before. This could go one way or the other. But we'll jump straight into it. So today we're kind of wanting to look about the environmental radiological impacts of the nuclear industry, really across the whole fuel cycle, and just provide a bit of context of how that compares with some of the wider environmental aspects. So just to kick off, you'll see this wonderful map, which I have taken no credit for whatsoever. And this really kind of gives you an overview that at the moment, nuclear power is already a big part of the world. So there are about 440 nuclear reactors operating around the world, and they provide about 10% of the entire world's electricity generating capacity. But that's only going up. So you've got another 60 which are currently under construction right now, and obviously there are various government plans to expand it even further. So for instance, in the UK, we've committed to about 8 or 9 additional small modular reactors and potentially 1 additional gigawatt plant as well along the way. Now, this is all related predominantly to tackling the climate crisis and energy generation that's going to be needed to support that, but also this has triggered wider consideration of the environment as a whole. And there's some great examples of that within the Sustainable Development Goals, but also through things like the EU taxonomy, which really tested some of the environmental considerations around nuclear power, both from a positive and a negative point of view.
So if you didn't hear me, my apologies. I'm from the mining industry and I have 40 years experience in operations. My first task is to say, what do we mean by the environment? And it's a bit like, what is dose? There are many interpretations on what the environment is. But from an operational perspective, what we tend to do is think about aspects, impacts, and receptors, or source pathway receptors. And an aspect is usually what we use is identified as something which causes a concern or reason to lead to an impact on a receptor. So thinking about those three separately gives us a way of processing what the environment might look like. We then assess the size of those potential impacts, and that usually occurs through either modelling for a new project or an expansion to a project, or through monitoring. The aspects, of course, depend upon many, many factors, including the type of operation, the location, and some of the social concerns in that particular area. Includes things like emissions to the air and to groundwater, noise, land disturbance, waste management, and these are things that can impact on receptors. And of course, the key receptors are people, members of the public, and flora and fauna. And I would refer you to the second picture up there of the cute little bunny rabbit. In some jurisdictions, a cute little bunny rabbit might be considered something that needs to be protected. In other jurisdictions, it devastates the landscape. So in Australia, cute little bunny rabbits, I won't use the word, are pests and require control to remove, and require more than just eradication. It's plans in place to prevent their spread.
You still used eradication.
And here's a bit more detail on some of the aspects that might be associated with the nuclear industry. And when we say nuclear industry here, please think about it as quite large, from production of uranium through to production of energy, through to waste disposal. And these aspects apply across all facilities, from mining through to energy production to the waste management, and across the whole of the nuclear fuel cycle. Radioactive discharges, emissions, waste management are all a number of aspects. And the key point about all these little spokes is to say that radiation is one of those. There are a number of aspects that need to be considered when we talk about the environment as a whole. And we have a couple of examples later where getting the risks and the aspects out of perspective can result in detrimental environmental outcomes. I've got a couple of examples of that. The impacts and aspects are identified and quantified usually in a thing called, or a tome called, an environmental impact statement or an environmental impact assessment. Here's an example of one that I worked on about 10 years ago. It was for the expansion of a copper uranium mine. It ended up being 15,000 pages long. The radiological impacts were assessed and then considered to be negligible. And how did we do that? Well, we did the modelling. We did conservative modelling. We looked at emissions. We looked at emissions to groundwater. Then we did the ERICA assessment. I'll talk a bit more about ERICA assessment later. But despite this, there was a disproportionate focus on radiation in the licence conditions. Unfortunately, the expansion did not proceed. That was partly due to cost, but mainly due to the length of the approval process, which went for more than 5 years. Now, not to be outdone, Pete told me last night that Sizewell C had 44,000 pages and took 10 years. You know, always got to try and outshine the miners. But the purpose of these first few slides is really just to say, when we talk about environment, we talk about radioactivity, there's a number of other things we need to keep in perspective. And it's the same with health and safety. There are a number of risks and a number of aspects that we need to consider in any environmental impact assessment. Okay.
So, I mean, this is probably one of our last slides before we go into the actual radiological impacts, but I think one thing that's really important to consider is when you're looking at environmental aspects, you're not just looking at it for one particular technology. When you're looking at deploying for things such as energy generation, you actually also need to have a fair and level playing field to compare other technologies to look at their environmental impacts, both from a positive and a negative point of view. So for an example here, you'll see a wonderful map which says that the amount of energy we get from something like Sizewell C is the amount of land it takes up with that tiny blue dot. The equivalent we would require from a solar panel production is the orange area. The amount of land we require for wind farm production to do the equivalent is the amount of yellow area. And so in those cases, there are important things to consider around things such as the land usage and how that land usage is affected. So for instance, if you take up more land for use of renewables, for instance, that will be taking away potential wildlife, potential land for natural habitats as well. It's not saying that you don't have a balance of all these energy sources, it's just an example that you need to also compare the benefits of other technologies. And then the part at the very bottom shows a little bit about comparisons around carbon emissions as well. And again, it's just noting the importance of the fact that any mixed generational energy source has a range of different carbon emissions associated with it. Nothing is zero carbon, so it's really important to take that into account. Nuclear power currently is the lowest form of energy generation with the lowest carbon footprint, but again, I'm not saying it's not a balance of the two, it's just saying important to draw comparisons between the different technologies. So this is my poor attempt at drawing a nuclear fuel cycle. I can tell I've definitely worked in a scientific and engineering world. We like boxes. Boxes are easy. So obviously there's all the parts up front from mining, conversion, enrichment to fuel fabrication. There's the different parts of nuclear power station construction, operation and eventual decommissioning. And then there's the end point, which is the waste disposal piece. For this particular talk, we're now going to focus on the radiological impacts from mining, construction, operation and decommissioning and waste management. The reason we've chosen not to cover everything is we'd probably need about 3 hours, and it took us a long time even to reduce it down to this number of slides. So we can't cover everything. We're trying our best to cover some of the key points.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Let me start by saying that uranium mining is quite common. And the methods for mining and mineral processing and uranium extraction are well understood. There are about 10 countries in the world that produce more than 95% of the world's uranium, but that depends. That changes depending upon economics. It depends upon supply and demand. When the downturn occurred in the nuclear industry after the Fukushima incident, the energy generators honoured their fuel supply contracts. So there was a bit of material in stockpiles in many of the facilities around the world. It's quite interesting. No matter who I talk to, you use the word mining, and everyone has a different picture in their head. I remember taking my dad underground to a uranium mine once, and he was just blown away. He said, look at the size of the vehicles you have here. Look at what's occurring. Look how clean it is. And so some of us have different pictures. But mining, again, is one of these really wide words, like environment, and has a number of different meanings. One thing is for sure, and that is that mining is very diverse. You can go from open pit mines, and many of you might have seen the Ranger uranium mine or some of the large copper uranium mines in South America, through to underground, very complex underground mines. They have their challenges from a radiation safety perspective if there's uranium involved, of course, even if there's not from a radon perspective. And then a lot of the uranium these days is being produced via in situ recovery or in situ leach. And that's a non-invasive, very selective uranium mining method. Interestingly, for the traditional mining methods, underground and open cut, most of what you mine is thrown away. So you might take a percentage of the material that you mined, that you grind, that you process, and you throw the rest away as tailings or waste rock. So the environmental issues, you start to think about what are the environmental issues, and there's land access, land use issues, and landform issues, and various other aspects associated with large volumes of material. Also with a mine site, it's not just the mine, there's a whole lot of other stuff. Most of the people employed at a mine site do not do mining. Their support services, maintenance, laboratories, transport and services. The key is when we talk about mining, it is very, very diverse, and that's the same for uranium mining. As I said, very diverse. We only produce about 50,000 tonnes of uranium a year out of the mining industry, out of the uranium production industry. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a high-value product. Interestingly, does anyone know how much coal we produce each year? No. 8 billion tonnes of coal is produced each year, is mined each year. In fact, 2022 was the highest year on record for coal production, and we produce something like 100 million barrels of oil per day from the resources industry. So uranium mining is a dot. Your big circle's a little tiny dot in terms of the whole mining side of things. So it's important to keep that in perspective. The known world resources, so a resource is what is known to exist, is about 6 million tonnes. And as I said, the methodology for extracting uranium via mining and via the mineral processing is very well understood. In terms of the radiological impacts, when we consider environmental radiological impacts of uranium mining these days, let me say that again, these days, not what existed post-war, but these days, they're generally very, very low. How do we know this? We measure, we monitor. The industry does a lot of measurements and monitoring of radiation exposures to workers, as well as diesel exposure, silica exposure, noise exposure, heat exposure, and industrial hazard exposure. And there are many methods to assess impacts to the environment. For members of the public, it's doing monitoring in communities. It's also doing modelling in communities. For flora and fauna, it is the ERICA assessment. And can I just say, please don't change the ERICA assessment too much. It's taken 10 years for it to be operationalised, and many operations will use it on a regular basis as part of their reporting mechanism. And the way they use that is they look at deposited, for example, dust measurements, and they input that, determine a change in media concentrations in order to determine impact. If there was something to be added to, it would be concentration ratios. There's not enough concentration ratios around for different considerations. So the impacts to people and the environment from the uranium mining from present operations is very, very low.
So then we go on to construction of new nuclear power stations. Now, this probably won't surprise anyone, but when you're building a new nuclear power station, there are no radioactive discharges. If there are, something's gone horribly wrong. There's also no radioactive waste. The reason I raise this is one of the things we've been asked to report as part of a sustainable investment is how much radioactive waste do we generate during construction? I can answer that now, 0. It's relatively straightforward. So what are the key sources of radioactivity or potential impacts from the construction of a new nuclear power station? Well, you do use X-ray postal scanners. You do use nuclear density gauges. You also use these wonderful radiography sources. Now, does anyone want to take a guess how many radiography sources we have on our new build station in Hinkley Point C, which is a sister project in the southwest of the UK? I won't let Thierry answer because he knows the answer to this one.
I don't.
Oh, well, no, you answer either. Anyone take a guess?
Cameron.
Come on, someone take a guess. Oh, 10, well, 15, 10, 15. 70 radiography sources. Does anyone want to take a guess how many radiography shots we do at peak per week, sorry?
Come on.
Let's go over 100 higher or lower.
Higher.
1,000 higher or lower. 2,000 shots per week. Okay. 70 radiography sources, 2,000 shots per week. Largest radiography site in Europe. Actually, a nuclear power station during construction is probably the biggest radiological risk in its life cycle of construction, operation, and decommissioning. So what's the environmental impact? Well, the dose to the public is negligible, because in reality, from things like radiography, they're nowhere near the site perimeter, you're not radiographing near it. But what about pigeons? Something I never thought we'd be looking at. So this is a photo from one of our construction sites, and we realized where we're doing radiography, we had a slight problem. You see, a lot of wildlife like nesting in construction sites, in pipes, in various things like scaffolding areas. And here's a wonderful photo of a pigeon and a nest that we found nesting right next door to where we were radiographing. So you start having to do environmental impact assessments, actually looking at wildlife sometimes being the dominant part in some of these scenarios, just to say no pigeons were hurt in the creation of this nuclear power station. You go into operation of a nuclear power station, and I think it's relatively straightforward. You know, we know that there are discharges to the air and to a water body, and that can be a river, that can be into the sea, and there's a generation of radioactive waste. And that can lead to basically exposures to the public, to flora, and to fauna. And I did love that someone pointed out to me when I was drafting these slides, because I'm terrible at drawing, as you can see. This is my attempt of a pictorial nuclear power station. And the first thing a colleague said to me was, "You've drawn that wrong. You don't have cooling water. You don't have cooling towers when you're next to the sea." Very true. Wasn't the point. It was me trying to draw a nuclear power station. So what do those impacts look like? Well, these are the doses to a representative person from sizable C. You'll see that it's 10 microsieverts per year from airborne discharges from terrestrial pathways, 3.1 from marine pathways, and the direct dose is a very, very, very tiny amount of that, which predominantly comes from the waste stores, which is 0.025 microsieverts per year. And that gives you around 13 microsieverts per year. Now, obviously, there are sensitivities, and that's quite a conservative assessment. I know the one done by our regulator came back lower, and one for our sister project, Hinkley, was around 3 microsieverts per year. That's driven by different habits, and that has a massive impact in terms of your doses. In terms of flora fauna, probably the best way of saying is everything was at least an order of magnitude below the ERICA screening value of 10 micrograde per hour. And even the lowest and most stringent derived concentration reference level, which was 4 micrograde per hour, were significantly below that as well. So the impacts really are very, very tiny from operating a nuclear power station. And I'll also say, even from operating a new nuclear power station, even under the worst case accident situations, the doses now are incredibly low, in fact below 1 millisievert. Decommissioning of a power station. So what are the kind of key phases of decommissioning a power station? So there's removal of the fuel. There's decontamination of the facilities, where you try and remove any non-fixed contaminants. Then there's just taking apart, taking out the main activated components, and then it's a conventional demolition job. A lot of it is conventional demolition. And at the very end of it, it is spent fuel management. But as time has gone on, a lot of these modern reactors are all designed with decommissioning in mind. So what we mean by that, it means that the system structures and components are designed to be decontaminated. So I'll give you a very simple example on the EPR reactor. You take out the fuel, and you flush the entire primary circuit with something called Cord V. It's a specific chemical, and that just strips all of the non-fixed contaminants from the primary circuit because it's designed to work with a surface finish. So then what you're left with is activated components. You simply just take them out, and a lot of them are designed to be either taken out as a whole or to be size reduced in situ. As such, actually, there's very little need on a lot of modern reactor designs to break into contaminated systems, structures and components and resuspend any mobile activity. And I used to work in decommissioning of old legacy facilities, and what you would have to do is you would have to do lots of techniques like shock blasting, which is basically like firing a machine gun at a surface of a metal surface to strip out the contamination. It's very different now in terms of how the modern designs work. And therefore, actually, the doses for decommissioning are now predominantly actually bound by operation, or even less than operation, because of the fact you don't need to break into the components.
Thanks, Pete. One of the problems about doing a tag team act is you have to compromise on slides. And I wanted to put a tailings dam picture up, but Pete said, no, I've started the presentation, so you can do this. The purpose of this is to bring together those comments about environmental impacts and waste. This is a photo of the low-level waste facility, the UK waste facility, and it takes waste from all over the country. He may have put it on purpose, given that the Australian waste facility has just been blocked at a federal level, so we don't have a national waste repository. But at a mine site, we will have waste facilities, and I mentioned earlier the tailings facilities, where the residues from mining are deposited, and also the waste rock facilities. But essentially, they take all the materials, all the residues and wastes, where waste is designed as defined as something you may not use, which may change over time, of course, as economic things change or values change or extraction techniques change as well. So in terms of the long-term management of radioactive liabilities, your tailings may be radioactive. There are controls in terms of containment and then coverage at the end, and also seepage boards, which I would assume would be the same things for the low-level waste facility here. And this is the doses that were delivered. These were the doses that were obtained for, again, the receptors, members of the public, and the flora and fauna from the operation of the UK facility. The key thing here is, don't worry about the detail in the slide. I think everyone gets access to the slides. The key things that stand out are the actual doses to people. Doses to people are very, very low. And what I find really amazing is the doses, less than 100 microsieverts per year, were predominantly from radon. So where's the radon come from? Well, if there's norm wastes being deposited in this low-level radioactive facility, then there will be the emanation of radon, of course. And then with non-human biota, again, very low levels, factors of 1,000 less than the screening levels.
Okay, and lastly, this is probably the most contentious of all, is disposal of intermediate level waste, high level waste and spent fuel. And I'll deliberately just emphasise the point here that spent fuel is not necessarily a waste, it's also a resource if used in the right way. So it's why we often refer to it slightly separately. Now, in the case of geological disposal, which is the preferred disposal method for a lot of countries on higher activity wastes, generally a geological disposal facility is the preferred option. But there are still some releases to the environment, and those can be from actual gaseous releases from the waste packages themselves, potential releases into groundwater, from copper corrosion of the canisters, etc. Now, to give an example, SKB's environmental safety case predicted exposure of around 1.5 microsieverts per year. Similarly, in the UK generic safety case for GDF, it's around about the same values as well. And yet there are not been yet any assessments done on non-human boat, because it's going to get much more complicated when you look at it from a underground deep geological disposal facility. But I think it's fair to say that given those types of doses, it's likely to be negligible. So what we've tried to do is then summarise, here are an idea of some of the different kind of key life cycle parts of the nuclear fuel cycle. As you can see, the dominant areas of radiological exposure are predominantly waste management and mining. That's right, Jim, sorry to throw mining under the bus. But actually the key message here is the doses are actually incredibly small. For everything you're dealing with here, they are very small. So in a lot of cases, radiological impacts of these facilities and these life cycles should not dominate your environmental considerations, and you need to take on board the wider environmental impacts.
Thanks, Pete. In bringing this presentation to a conclusion, we'd like to provide you with an example of and I'm going to use the word here, the madness that can occur in environmental radiation regulation. As co-chair of the ICRP task group on norm, we've been collecting examples like this. We want to produce, or we are producing, a practitioner's handbook for people just to look at how to do things well and not well in practice. This is an example of the broader environmental benefits from recycling, right? Recycling. Let's get the circular economy moving. Let's get so we reduce the amount of our footprint on the planet. From recycling being prevented by unnecessary application of radiation rules. In this example, that piece of equipment there is called a front-end loader, and you usually burn through your buckets. That's the big thing at the front, the scoop at the front, at quite a rate of knots. Now, that might be 1 or 2 tonnes of metal that can be recycled. If you're moving, for example, low-grade uranium ore, you can get rust occurring, you can get ingrained particles of radioactive material into that rust. There's a surface contamination clearance level. If you exceed the surface contamination clearance level, it's defined as a surface contaminated object. If you tried to put that into a metal recycler, they're reluctant. Why? Because there's load of buckets that are not contaminated that they can take much more readily. So there's a bit of a differentiation there. If you do the maths, it's less than a 0.1 Beck per gram, the total activity of that piece of metal. In this case, the cost of cleaning, right? Yeah, yes, you can clean it. You can use sandblasting. You can use acid, etc. Exceeds the value of what would be obtained by selling it into the scrap market. So, an economic decision's made. There's a bit of margin there. You can push it a bit to add some extra cost, but in the end, it becomes an economic discussion, and then the bucket gets thrown away, which is tragedy. It's a lost resource. Now, I don't blame anyone in this process, but what I do blame is a complex system. And the complex system is sophisticated, we all know that, and that's good, we like that. But if we start with a complex system that needs to go through multiple interpretations, from philosophy through to standards, through to legislation, then intent can be diluted. And once intent gets diluted, it gets lost. Ultimately, a regulation is implemented by lawyers. And it's quite difficult having a discussion with a lawyer when it's, is this radioactive? Well, it's only no, you didn't answer my question. Is this radioactive or not? And so we've got to be very careful of what ends up there. And so part of what we've done with this last example is just to provide some of the examples of what's happening in practice in order to say how can we, as designers of the system, improve the situation. Sorry.
So last slide, so don't worry, you've made it through, pretty much, if we can get through in the last 2 minutes. So I think the key summary points really is, we're noting there is a resurgence in new nuclear in various countries across the globe. That's in support of tackling climate change. Now, the key messages here really are there are a lot of different environmental aspects that need to be considered when looking at new nuclear or any technology. It's not just radiation. Radiation is one of many. And you need to look at both the positives and the negatives. The radiological impacts are dominated predominantly by mining and waste management, but are very, very small still. So if I look at my new nuclear power station, do I worry about my 10 microsieverts of discharges? That is not my predominant concern. My predominant concern when I'm operating a station for the environment will be due to discharges from my cooling water system, which are non-radioactive, and predominantly things like heat, because heat being discharged into a marine environment can have a big impact. So again, it's really important to make sure you have a balanced view on what you need to look at as your priorities. The kind of key messages we came back with for the system of radiological protection is it needs to strengthen the consideration of the environment, including within decision-making processes and the application of optimization. Great to see your slide, Andy, and about the potential additional category on environment. Consider all environmental aspects. And I think we all know we need to do this. It's just formalising it and saying we do need to consider all environmental aspects in our decision-makings alongside societal and economic factors. And if we come back to what Andy was saying earlier, he said there are 3 pillars to sustainability: environment, society, economics. So actually all we're saying is we need to start moving to a sustainable outcome from our decisions. We need to ensure proportionate treatment of radiological impacts alongside the wider environmental impacts. And I think, coming back to Jim's point, there's an opportunity here to really reduce complexity and to focus on improving practicality and, importantly, outcomes, because outcomes is what's really going to matter here. and observe what's happening on the ground. As Jim said, there's no one to blame for it, but there is some difficulties in terms of what's then fundamentally applied at times, which are leading to non-sustainable outcomes. So what can we do to improve, change, and shift that decision-making process? And that is it. 34 seconds to spare. I don't think we've ever finished a talk early.
We can still talk.
No, we shouldn't talk more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent, engaging presentation and also helped give us a broader perspective. We are going to shift into our discussion now, and I'll ask my colleagues all the way across the hall if you will be kind enough to share the microphone. Yes, with each other? Okay, we're all friends. And so I can take questions from the floor, but I can also start. I'll start. So one of the things that Andy mentioned, and that I think was kind of emphasized then later with our second presentation, is this idea of added value. So we can't do anything about the complexity of the science, right? It is what it is. But then we also don't want to change just for the sake of change. So for my distinguished colleagues, how do we evaluate added value? What's the best way to do that and strategy for added value so we're not adding things just for the sake of change?
Why is everyone looking at me? I don't. I feel quite strange sat at the back here, like we've been a naughty boy or something. Yeah, it's a very good question, isn't it? In the UK, as an example, before any new policies or regulations are implemented or put in place, there has to be an impact assessment. And this is just an example, really, but that impact assessment has to carry out quite an in-depth appraisal of various criteria, so social, economic, and environmental criteria. So we have a framework for evaluation of any policy initiative or new laws and regulations. So that's one example of how you can evaluate the added value of new policies and regulations and so on. But coming back to the issue of what I think Jim called sort of madness in outcomes. For me, that's a very good point, and it kind of demonstrates for me why we need to take more of a systems approach to these issues. I think societies and economies now are kind of we're recognizing more and more that the interconnectivity of social and economic and environmental factors, and it's no longer acceptable to treat them all in isolation and through that kind of silo mentality. So I think there is a need, I think, for bodies like ICRP and others to sort of take that more of a systems approach, because one thing I'm almost allergic to as a regulator, and one who likes to see good integrated solutions, is unintended consequences. And we've all seen them in various environmental regulation across the world. We've seen those cases where, through good intention, we've tried to control one particular impact or risk, only to find that we're increasing a risk or impact somewhere else. And that, for me, that as an environmental regulator, that's not what should be happening. So I hope that answers your question.
Pete?
Just from a modeling standpoint, because that's where I come from, I've actually developed models in the past just to help evaluate your uncertainties, conducting sensitivity testing, and to help focus your research on the areas where you have the greatest added value. Because often I found a lot of research, you go down a path and you might be creating great data, but it's not impacting your overall ability to see the larger picture.
I mean, I'll just add to the point that, part of it is we shouldn't beat ourselves up that we have scenarios that we've not necessarily got the right outcome. We learn from it, we've improved for it. If we remain outcome focused, which is what we want to achieve here, is the best value added, the most sustainable outcome, then we learn and we adapt. And I think that's the overarching piece that needs to be here. It should be about achieving the sustainable outcome at the end of it. What I would say also is the world is shifting. Andy made an amazing point. The treatment of non-sustainable outcomes are just no longer going to be tolerated going forward. And that's not just from a regulation point of view, but a financial point of view. You've probably all seen that there's been a massive shift in the last few years around sustainable financing. And so it's no longer just governments and regulators pushing it, there's the financing world. The future of financing and trade is based on sustainable outcomes and ESG. And that means that if we can't demonstrate that the system of protection delivers on that, we'll be left behind. So we already need to know that's got to be the outcome we're aiming for. That's the kind of statements we need in there. And just put our hands up and say, at times we got it wrong, what can we do to improve from it?
Okay, thank you. On a very pragmatic point of view, actually, to demonstrate something and to be, you want to be convincing with the approach, you are taken if you are an assessor and if you are a regulator. So that means that the demonstration for radiological protection of the environment needs to be robust and convincing. And for that, you need to rely on the value of the benchmark you are going to take. You need to rely on the method you are going to use for your demonstration. Is someone understandable and compatible with those methods that I use for other stressors? I'm thinking about chemicals, for example. Since you are dealing with biodiversity, you need also to be convincing that the approach or the concepts that has been using and underlying the method are credible and bring something practical on the table. So having said that, this is what the priority we have put on the goal of TG99, developing a method that allows to have at the end of the day a method that is transparent, meaning you can see any data underlying the what we have named the endpoint sensitivity distribution. You can have a look to any of the data underlying this statistical distribution. Of course, it is statistics, so meaning that there are part of empirism into this empirical data, but they are observed, and some of them we have injected also some empirical statistical approach through the use of acute effects data. But this is one technical issue we can discuss later because it's more technical. So the method is transparent, the method is reproducible, meaning that with the same set of underlying data, anyone should come out with the same benchmark values. The method is systematic. You can apply it. We have done it at the level of the class, not to be so far from the previous, the present method as promoted by publication 108, and flexible, meaning that you need to be able to apply it and to keep your robustness and your credibility, whatever the situation you have to apply it. So what we have done can be the underlying knowledge organized so that you can demonstrate where you are with regard to effects, but real or potential or plan in plan exposure situation, existing one, and also for acute we have not been commented here, acute effects data and related endpoint sensitivity distribution. We are able to inform with this way of showing the knowledge we have in a similar way, and that can inform the dialogue with any type of stakeholders, for example. So I think this is the added value, really, of what has been done. And just to be also very pragmatic, actually the 10 micrograms per hour outcoming from ERICA, so which is one of the EC-funded former project, came from the same methodology. And the majority of the data used for what we have done in TG 99 are the same. So.
Can I make a quick comment? Total left field. All very good comments, but the word value, when you said the word value, two words jumped into my mind, carrot or stick. And from an operator's perspective, if there is incentive to throw things away, they will. If there's incentive to recycle, they will. And there's a margin there. It's not clear cut, it's not binary, it's distribution, of course, and depends upon the company, depends upon their policies and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, if there's a value in recycling and contributing to sustainable development, that'll occur. Beyond writing the policies about it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Andy, did you want?
Yeah, just to come back, I mean, it's a good point, yeah. And in terms of that example of the recycling example, driven by the international basic safety standards, you know, the kind of exemption criteria, and it kind of, so it begs the question, really, what sort of impact assessment was considered in terms of, you know, setting that framework, because, you know, that ultimately is acts as a legal constraint for, as we've seen, circular economy principles. So, you know, so moving forward, you know, that goes back to my earlier point that sort of international policy, guidelines, standards, down to national implementation, we need to have better ways of assessing these changes and recommendations, don't we, really, to try and avoid the situation that.
So I do want to pause there just to make sure that there's nothing from the floor.
Yeah.
Or do we like this line of discussion? Yes. Someone's coming with a microphone.
Thank you. My name is Benjamin Zorko, Slovenia. I have a question for Peter. I saw some values of the dose estimation for the size well C. So they are prospective values. Am I right? So did you perform this by using PC cream or some? So these values are a little bit high from my point of view. So do you expect that these values during the operation will increase or not?
So you know, they are high, they are conservative, and just give an indication, when we do our assessment, we always get an independent assessment done by the regulator as well. Theirs came out lower than ours, as we've probably chosen a few conservative factors. And even if you look at how some of the ICRP values around things like carbon have changed recently, that will reduce it down even further as well. So we do expect them to be less than what they are there.
Thank you.
Other questions from the floor? Yes?
Jean-Christophe Gariel from IRSN. Thank you for these two very interesting presentations. I have just a very naive and perhaps provocative question. What happens if an accident occurs? What do you do?
For, like, in terms of protection of the environment?
Yes,
or?
yes.
It's a very good question, and I'm now going to put on my TG 120 hat, and we've got Anne in the audience as well. So that is something we are considering from how do we incorporate environment into the emergency phase, and that's not just from a nuclear industry, it's wider than that, it's about the types of events you might come across. What I would say, though, is in a lot of, and I'll talk about modern reactor designs here, the modern reactor designs are actually allowed to even have a controlled core melt in those scenarios, and so the impacts are incredibly limited for those types of cases. But from older plants, obviously it's a very different story, and there needs to be a really delicate balance. It all comes down to decision making, doesn't it, really? It's how do you make a decision, and depending on which phase you're in, if you're in that emergency phase, urgent phase for action needing to be taken, your primary aim is life-saving. The environment should be a consideration well along it, because that could lead to longer term exposures, but your primary aim is life-saving, and that should be your first starting point. So it's different in an emergency. The way you make your decisions might be more hurried. You necessarily can't run lots of assessments. You need to make decisions quickly sometimes in those scenarios, but the environment's an important part that needs to be considered within that. I do agree.
I'm going to add just a comment to that. I'm not on his task group, but something to consider as well goes back to Jim's point of what is the environment. And also, so we have livestock and things like that in our managed environment that kind of fall under this as well, that would need to be considered in an emergency. Looks like Andy.
Yeah, just building on Pete's point there. Once you get into the, after the acute emergency phase, when you get into the decontamination and cleanup and remediation phase, then that's the when the environment can be considered more holistically. And as Nicole's mentioned, we're promoting the concept of the sustainable remediation in the NEA and ICRP and others. So that's the point at which you can take into account the environmental impacts of the accident itself, from the contamination on the ground, and also, as I mentioned earlier, the impacts and benefits of protective and remedial actions as well, because you have to make that balance. As we've seen it, in some cases, the efforts to clean up radioactivity has led to negative environmental impacts in some places, which so that's in the later phase of cleanup.
Yes, if I may, also I encourage you to read the chapter of what Han presented yesterday, building a framework for preparedness for recovery after a nuclear accident, and there is an entirely dedicated chapter on protection of the environment and of the natural resources. And what we have done at the present time under our TGs is also to provide data that are structured enough to not to change the priority in the early response of an accident in terms of protective actions, but really to inform what we believe could be the potential damages based on the knowledge. So that's the reason why we have also taken care of the knowledge we have on the effects of acute exposure on non-human species, and this is ready to be used.
Thank you. Terry has a question or comment.
Yeah, Thierry Schneider. I'm chair of Committee 4. So listening to the two presentations, and notably the presentation from WNA, we may have the feeling at the end that finally there is no need to take care of the radiological protection of the environment, because what you demonstrate is that everything is going well and we are well below the impact on the environment. So I'm a little bit disappointed with that, and to be provocative, of course, in most of the situation, unfortunately, in planned exposure situation, you will not impact the environment. But you will not impact the environment because you take some action and you organize a vigilance not to do it. So it should be good to have in mind how far the development of ICRP in radiological protection of the environment is helpful. So you mentioned at the end that we have obligation to simplify, and then you say opportunity, which is better than obligation. but then what could be the conclusion, and in which way we can go ahead, having in mind that we have not only planned exposure situation, as Jean-Christophe Garriel mentioned, we need to take care of accident, we need to take care of legacy site and so on. So there are different aspects where everything is not going so well as we can expect, and then the environment could be a challenge. And beyond that, we can see that For example, the discharge of treated water in Fukushima, this is beyond, this is due to the radioactivity. We cannot say that it's not the radioactivity, and then it's beyond the impact that we can observe on the environment. So how to deal with that, and if we want to discuss sustainable development and protection of the environment, this is some issue to be addressed.
So I think, first of all, obviously, we're not saying do not protect the environment from radiation. I think what we're trying to emphasize is the importance of and this comes back to sustainability. Sustainability also looks at the fact you've got a balance of economics, society, and that includes your resources you've got available, and you've got the environment as well. So what we're saying is make sure you're prioritizing your effort in the place you can make the most improvement. So great example being, as I said before, nuclear power stations, a lot of the impacts are actually conventional in nature. So you'll tend to find, for instance, nuclear power stations run emergency diesel generators. You use them to test a response to, in the event of a serious event. Those diesel generators generate a lot of discharges, which can have impact from sulfur and also nitrogen dioxide. So those are probably areas you might want to look at optimizing further than necessarily focusing on reducing a planned exposure, which is already very low further. So it's more about balancing. It's not saying you don't do it, it's about saying make sure you have a balanced decision. And what I'd also emphasize here is the big part here is, fully agree, emergencies, that's a different scenario. We have to look at those parts and all the other parts there. So say this is all important work. What I'm saying here is, how do we integrate this all together? And actually, the part of environment's the easier part. If we talk about sustainable development, the part of environment is the easier part to integrate. So what do I mean by this? And this is also where we shouldn't be hard on ourselves, because this isn't just an issue for radiation, it's an issue in other areas as well. So I'll take a very simple example. As part of the construction of our power station, we need to deliver aggregate to our site. That aggregate has to meet a certain level of standard of how good the aggregate is. So we have a thing called the RAP protocol. We committed, because it's a sustainable thing to do, to get our aggregate from a local community. Reduces the environmental impact of transporting over large distances. It's great for the local community in terms of jobs, economy. That is the right sustainable outcome to do. So the aggregate arrives on site. It doesn't meet the required standard. So what's the first and easiest thing to do? Immediately go further afield, import it from further afield, so your environmental impacts go up. You're not contributing to the local community, so it's actually a less sustainable outcome. And the right decision there will probably be you actually help upskill the local community to bring up the standard of the resource you're doing. So it's not an easy thing. There are two elements to sustainability. What we can do in the modelling side and for things like an environmental impact assessment, that's at a strategic level. But understand that sustainable development and really delivering against those goals happens at a strategic side and at a day-to-day working level. And those are where the decisions are much harder to get. It's not simple, but I do agree with you, Thierry. I'm not saying do not regulate the environment from radiation. It's about balancing it out, and there's a lot more to consider. And I'd say for part around environment's one piece, how we measure societal benefit will be another problem.
Unfortunately, we are at the end of the time, but I see a Werner raised his hand, and for you, I will make an exception.
Thank you very much. I found this session very, very interesting, especially the connection to the sustainable development, sustainable goals. I like that. And I would like to get your presentation, because there were a lot of aspects which I want to use in the future in my arguments. But I just want to say one thing to avoid any misunderstanding. ICRP is not nuclear driven. And ICRP is also not anti-nuclear driven. So we are focusing on radiation protection. For us, it is important that from nuclear industry, the normal releases are very low. This is exactly what we want. And they are low because RP is used there. But we also want to take care about emergencies, especially here in Japan. We saw that. We had the Fukushima visit just last week with the main commission. So we take care about everything. So please, this is the take-home message. We are not nuclear-driven, and we are not anti-nuclear-driven. We are neutral. In this case, we are focusing on radiation protection. Once you go home, you may have your own individual idea. Me too, by the way. But as ICRP, we focus on RP. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That's an important clarification. I appreciate that. Let's acknowledge our speakers.